Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about US history. Today is March 28th, 2026, and we are still in women's history. Well, I did take several courses in women's, women's US history, US women's history, that is, and some feminist courses. So I got myself educated in some of the rights of women. That's principal regarding principal actors and events and things that shaped the feminist movement and including the women's suffrage movement. Uh, but before, of course, uh, women got the right to vote in America in on June they didn't get the right. It passed Congress, that is June 4th, 1919. That's very important. That's when Congress passed the voting rights, which uh, prohibited denial of the vote based on sex. Right at that time, lawfully in America, only men could vote. Um, and of course, it wasn't ratified until 1920, right? So on June 4, 1919, the Congress passed the voting rights, right, that prohibited um, denial of the vote based on sex. So basically, giving women the right to vote, and then it wasn't ratified. That means it didn't become law. It didn't become codified in the U.S. Constitution until August 1920, when it was ratified by Tennessee. I think Tennessee was the 36th state at that time. So that was in 1920, August 1920, women got the right to vote. Our president at that time was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was our 28th president. Of course, it was under him that the uh, White House first screened a movie, and the movie happened to be Birth of the Nation, a very racist movie that glorified the Ku Klux Klan. At that time, the movie was actually called The Klansman. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the history of women's suffrage. Um, if anybody tries to couch U.S. history and the uh, movement for equality as simply in black or white terms, they're either a fool or they are just lying and deceiving, trying to be deceptive and manipulative. So America's history is very complicated, very complex, and we particularly see this during the history of, the suffragette movement or the suffragist movement of to give women the right to vote, because many of the principal actors in the suffragist movement um, were also the principal actors in the abolitionist movement that ended slavery. So there was an abolitionist movement. So we'd find that apart from the black activists in the abolitionist movement, many also participated in these black actors also participated in the suffragist movement. That's to get women the vote, right? Um, People like Frederick Douglass, who had been born a slave, who was a black man who was born a slave. Of course, he was very active in the abolitionist movement, but he was also similarly very active in the suffragist movement. Interestingly, he'd been from Maryland, right, and he moved to Massachusetts. There, he married a white woman. Apart from him, there was another principal actor named Archibald Grimke. Archibald Grimke is very interesting, is a very important person. I'm going to do something and talk about the Grimke family. In fact, his aunties, his half aunties, were very pivotal in the women's movement and in the abolitionist movement as well. That's Sarah Grimke and Angelina Grimke. She became Angelina Grimke Weld. I'm going to do a video later on and discuss this Grimke family. They're very instrumental in the abolitionist movement and in the feminist movement. So again, there's this huge intersection between the abolitionist movement to end slavery and also the suffragist movement. So Archibald Grimke, what I was going to say was he was born a slave, right, to a wealthy white slave owner um, and planter in South Carolina. But he was an interesting person. He went on to actually become accomplished. I'll do a video explaining that, and he became the second person to attend Harvard Law School. So he became an attorney. He became very successful. He became a consul to the Dominican Republic. And interestingly, he was president of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association. So you can see he was a black man, but he was president of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association, and their objective was to get women the vote. So, and similarly, white women who were very active in the abolitionist movement were also activists, were principal actors in the um, women's rights movement. So people like the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were the half aunts of Archibald Grimke, who was a black man. Now, Sarah and Angelina Grimke were white women, right? Their father had been a very wealthy planter, right? And I'm going to do a video discussing the family. Um, so other actors that were very active in both movements were Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth had been born a slave. She was a black woman, and she became a principal actor as well in the suffrage movement. Now, there are also people like Susan B. Anthony, whose views are very complex and they became very controversial. She had been a passionate abolitionist. Susan B. Anthony was a white woman. She'd been a passionate abolitionist, but once the Civil War ended and there was now the desire to get the vote, she would not, she refused to subordinate, she wanted to subordinate the move to give black men the vote to the women's suffrage movement. And she would make a number of racist and inflammatory remarks, particularly maybe to pander to white Southern women. So she said she refused to support any movement that would give black men the vote uh, before white women. And so you see, even though she'd been passionate, she'd been a wholehearted supporter of the abolitionist movement, but once that was achieved, once there was a conflict and there was this race between who got the vote first. The black men or women generally, or or white women generally. Well, people like Susan B. Anthony would subordinate the all other interests, including uh, giving black men the vote, to her own primary interest of making ensuring that white women got the vote. However, unfortunately, her goals, her desires were not met because black men got the vote prior to women getting the vote. Generally, in 1920, the the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the vote, was ratified in 1870. So that was 50 years before the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the vote in 1920, right? However, something I want to note is while there's you know, there's this complexity in the intersection, there's the intersection between uh, the abolitionists, right, and the suffragettes or suffragists, right? Um, Suffragist, again, that's the right to vote, right to vote, voting rights. And so we say suffragette when it's women who are pursuing it. Suffragist, it could be a man or a woman advocating for the right to vote. um Prior to that, so women had actually voted before 1919. This is, sorry, before 1920. 1920 was when it was ratified. It was ratified, and it became codified in the U.S. Constitution. But prior to that, women had actually voted long before that. The first recorded vote by a woman in America happened in 1756. 1756, and the woman who voted was Lydia Chapin Taft. She was a wealthy widower, right? She was a wealthy widower, and she had a son. Her son was underage, so she voted by proxy, and three times. And she first voted in 1756, and this was to appropriate funding for the French and Indian Wars. I've done a video discussing the 7 Year War, which the British fought against the French on behalf of the Americans uh, to win the very fertile Ohio River Valley, right? And it was after this war was won that the British tried to impose the controversial taxes that would be uh, the the instigation, the catalyst that led to the Declaration of Independence, right, in 1776. Now, interestingly, by July 2nd, 1776, when the declaration, the determination for the Declaration of Independence was made in July 1996. Sorry, 1776. Um, there were some states that explicitly restricted the vote to men, right? The right to vote to men. Now, by the way, it was Massachusetts, right? The colonial Massachusetts. That's where Lydia Chapin Taft. That was where she voted, right, in 1756, where she first voted. And she voted three times, right, up to 1758, and that was colonial Massachusetts. Um, Interestingly, the state of New Jersey from 1776 to 1807 also permitted its women, some counties, right, and the state generally uh, permitted the women to vote because its constitution did not make a distinction, right, between men and women, and they used what we call the gender neutral term they, right? So there was no express term to distinguish or define what gender could vote. So they used the gender neutral they, right? They, and they just had um, conditions, property, in terms of property, the person had to be of age, right? And then they had the property restrictions that they had to have £50 proclamation money, clear, and clear estate in the same. That just means that uh, they have a net worth of £50, right? After, so it's free and clear estate. That means they don't have any debts, right? After all their debts, everything's been settled. They have over £50, right? So £50 proclamation money, uh, clear estate in the same. That was the requirement. So women who had property could vote, right, up to 1807 in New Jersey. And so it's recorded that maybe about 75 women, had been casting their votes. Interestingly, though, it was normally single women who had property who voted, because women who were married, their rights were subordinate, their interests were subordinate to their husbands. So there was something called coverture that was part of the US laws back then. And of course, this is what the Seneca Falls Convention, right, which was the movement for women's rights. These were things that they wanted to address. So, uh, Seneca Falls Convention, that was in 1848, right? In the Seneca Falls and Wesleyan Chapel in New York, right? Seneca Falls in New York. That was where women had what's called the Declaration of Interest. And Declaration of Interest was supposed to be uh, it was supposed to address what women consider the shortcomings of the Declaration of Independence, which said all men are created equal. In the Declaration of Sentiments, they amended this to say all men and women are created equal, and they wanted to address the issue of the subjugation of women to men, and they wanted to advocate. They were trying to advance voting rights of women. Now, again, women could vote in New Jersey. They'd been voting in New Jersey. However, that lapse, what some it wasn't a lapse. It was a progressive. Uh, it was an unusually progressive area in New Jersey relative to the rest of the American colonies. But something significant happened in 1807, and the legislature of New Jersey decided to address that with the electoral reform law. So, um, of course, the men have started to get agitated that, women women were voted in increasing numbers. They were very active. They were those since they have the right to vote. They weren't restricted from voting. They had uh, they could influence significantly, outcomes, in politics and the law. And so it started to agitate this, patriarchal society in New Jersey, especially the incident that triggered this reform, right? The reform would eventually restrict voting rights to men, right? To men, tax-paying men. was There was an election in a county in which there was more ballot cast than more people voted than were eligible in this county. So there was voter fraud. It was marked, it was obvious. However, somehow uh, New Jersey's legislature laid the blame on women, solely on women, very irrationally on women, saying, well, it must have been women who committed the voter fraud. So they now went on to restricted. They went on to restrict voting rights to white men who paid taxes. Of course, they laid the blame on colored people as well, and immigrants, but specifically, explicitly, women. Women were those who were most impacted, as they expressly laid restricted voting to to males, and then later on they codified it in the Constitution in 1844 to white men, of course. And of course, things like this instigated the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which was advocating for the equality of women, which said all men and women are created equal. And interestingly, there are lots of um, religious elements to the movement uh, for women's suffrage in the 19th century, because those who subjugated, in colonial America with all the ideals, and then subsequent to the declaration to independence, they had these ideals of everyone's equal. Of course, they said all men are created equal, because some Christian sects and Christian dogma believed that um, men were created superior to women, and women were sort of an afterthought or created as a gift to men, right? So, of course, that was very patriarchal, very, it sort of codified a patriarchal, a paternalistic relationship of men to women. And these were conventions which the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 and the women's rights movement tried to address. And later on, there was these same women were advocating for what's called the Equal Rights Amendment, for equality to be enshrined in the U.S. Constitution as well. I'm going to continue with the videos and discuss some of the principal characters, especially the Grimke family, the Grimke sisters, particularly Sarah Grimke. Um, my name is Olurotimi Osha, and I will continue with my discussion on the voting rights of women. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.